So we've dealt with the relationships with the USA. Now we've got to deal with the relationships with the other superpower in that time. How we're a peaceful relationship between Britain and the USSR over the period of this course. Again, we've broken it into like 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and we do the same with the European Union, which we'll do afterwards. So in terms of the 50s with the Soviets, so we'll look at hostile first, because I believe it started off more hostile than other sides, and then kind of the peaceful element to this. So in what ways was the relationship hostile in the 50s? Obviously, there'd been fears the USSR wanted to invade Europe, and that, obviously comes in through, and obviously a fear of what was happening in Eastern Europe that links into Churchill's Iron Curtain speech about that descending across Europe and the division on there. There was a real fear of an expansionist USSR, but really Stalin wanted to satellite the states, he had them. But I think Stalin's death in 1953 eased those fears off because so up until Stalin's death, I think there was a real fear and a real threat of like communist expansion. And then Khrushchev kind of rolls that back when he comes in his de-Stalinification process. And that, you know, Khrushchev initiates a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West and a desire for both sides to avoid war. And I think that manifests itself in the fact that they basically sort of settle into this is your sphere of influence, this is my sphere of influence, in the same way that kind of Trump is doing with Putin at the moment. But like that peaceful coexistence that they're not going to push into each other's spheres of influence. Um, on the negative side, both sides still wanted to spread their influence internationally. British Empire was still active in the 50s. They're still trying to spread then along, basically as a junior partner with the Americans, spread capitalism, and the Soviet Union is still interested in spreading communism, although less. I think Mao was more interested in the kind of Trotskyite view of spreading communism everywhere, whereas Stalin was more based on ideology of holding what he has in his own kind of sphere of influence. Both sides were still accusing each other of imperialism in this period, um, which is the irony, both sides doing that. Um, as the British Empire collapses, this becomes interesting because the USSR tries to gain influence in former colonies in Africa and Asia. And this leads into like a real conflict between the USSR and the USA for that sphere of
Yeah,
influence to see
yeah,
like who will have the major influence over these fields. And again, like I said, that's actually quite influential, that Cold War need for reform in the civil rights movement in the United States to kind of eliminate social Darwinism in the South and Jim Crow. The West regarded the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe as imperialism. But of course, like the Soviets viewed the British Empire itself as imperialism. And of course, Suez becomes massively important for that because the Suez Crisis just reconfirms that idea of how the Soviets view Britain as an imperialistic nation. In October 1955, British and Russian navies exchanged goodwill visits. This is showing that even though they're not like ideologically aligned, they are back into the point of view where they're not actively hostile to each other. Khrushchev visits Britain in April 1956, and Macmillan goes to Moscow in February 1959. So it shows a kind of softening, almost like a détente of the relationship between the Soviets and the British. So I would say, while Stalin is still there, the relationships are quite hostile. But under Khrushchev, they mellow down, not to the point where they are necessarily friends, but to the point where
yeah,
they're actively looking to have a conflict with each other.
yeah. I think there's mutual suspicion,
Yeah,
but but a desire to. I think the key one is the desire to avoid war, or at least a direct war on both sides. So
yeah,
if there is conflict, it's around the periphery. It's around spheres of influence.
yeah.
Um,
And I, and I think the primary focus of the USSR is America. So,
yes, yeah,
and this moves in the 60s and 70s even more like that. Britain still sees the USSR as its main enemy because they are obviously the existential threat on the European continent in the same way that Russia is today.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
the one main actor that is, well, let's say rogue, but outside of the accepted positions of like standard conflict there. Um, Whereas the USSR, once the empire's gone, they see Britain as a dying power. Like the empire is fading, it's not really a problem. The real focus of the USSR is on the USA because they're
yes,
locked in an ideological Cold War, which is almost sort of semi-existential on their systems of government around the world. Um, and then obviously in the 60s and 70s, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurs that causes concerns in the West over Soviet ambitions. And like, but again, Macmillan is really, really important in calming JFK down in the Cuban Missile Crisis and making sure that it doesn't escalate. Although, each side is definitely still involved in espionage, and like the Soviets are basically the enemies in like every Bond film throughout that entire period.
Yeah, this is the time. This is the era of James Bond, and also Get Smart and all of that stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah. And the Soviets are always the enemy. So they are
They
just
are
seen as
always
the
the enemy.
enemy. But like I think, like I said, it's a Cold War, but it's probably an even colder war than with the Americans and the Soviets.
Yeah, but it's mutual. I've been told by a Russian friend
Yeah.
that in Russia they have, of course, action movies where it's the Americans that are the baddies.
Yeah, yeah. And not us, never the British.
Maybe the British as well. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sure. Maybe.
Yeah, there you go. That just shows how unimportant we are. We don't even qualify as the Russian Bond equivalents, bad guys.
Oh well.
Are they modeled on Putin and his KGB days? So, uh,
I actually don't know. I don't like to say it.
Agent Putin
That,
when he was young.
that's right. That's right.
Uh, uh,
Okay.
1980. So then 60s, 70s is quite a cold. There's not much happening in the Cold War. And then of course the 80s, 90s picks up because that's when
That's the
Reagan
collapse of the
comes in and the whole
USSR.
concept of the evil empire. So
Yeah.
key thing is Reagan goes in incredibly hard on the Soviets, basically saying they need to almost be destroyed, that they're the evil empire, that they're an existential threat. And it's
Yeah.
actually under Reagan that we get closest to a nuclear war, even closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the Soviets really fear that this is like some gung-ho cowboy mental case who's going to be taking down the empire. And like he basically says they need to stop existing. And he's obviously talking to his base. But there's one night, I can't remember what year it was, when it was middle 80s, when the Americans do a mock exercise on dealing with on a counter-strike measures, and they don't inform the Soviets they're going to do it. And there's one Soviet
Mm,
guy who's watching this thinking, are they about to attack? Because obviously Reagan's rhetoric as well. And
mm.
that luckily, that one Soviet has made the decision that it was a simulation. But when
Yeah.
Reagan found out, he crapped himself and realized that he needed to change his dialogue with the
Yeah.
Soviet Union
Yeah.
to avoid this. And I think Thatcher was quite important in shuttling back and forth between Gorbachev and Reagan as like the go-between. Um, so she got on well with Gorbachev, similar to Reagan, and so she had good personal relationships with both of them, and that helps as an interlocutor. And I think that's where Britain's role was strongest. And she did a lot to calm down Soviet fears over Star Wars, because as we saw from the last one, she herself wasn't much of a fan of the Star Wars system. And she could relay to Gorbachev that Reagan's rhetoric was more than his intention to do anything about it. Um,
Mm.
Albeit she wanted to maintain the nuclear deterrent, so she was the one who kind of convinced Reagan not to de-escalate all of his nuclear arms with Gorbachev. And obviously, she was known as the Iron Lady, which was the Soviets that coined that expression for her, as she was strongly anti-communist. But I think it was again anti-communist without wanting to escalate it into any kind of open
It's,
conflict. Um,
I mean, you definitely believe the Soviets if they called you the Iron Lady.
yeah,
I think it's a well-deserved nickname.
yeah. Apparently, it was a mistranslation. It was something else, but she took it. She liked it, and she took it.
Really? Mistranslation of what? Copper
I can't
Lady?
remember. They wanted to call her like, I don't know, stubborn or something. I don't remember what exactly it was. Apparently, it was a mistranslation,
Ah.
of something, but she liked it so much she took it and used it. They meant it as an insult, and she took it as a compliment. Just
Clever.
ran with it.
Oh, of course, right.
Yeah, it's quite a good one to have. And then relationships massively improve, obviously, through Glasnost and Perestroika under Gorbachev. Like the Soviet Union, like de-escalates away from being a communist centralized state. Collapse of the USSR in December 1991 changed the relationship as Yeltsin became the new leader. And Britain had helped him resist the Soviet hardliners. They'd been really important in that. And it was the UK that was influential in getting Russia into global clubs like G8, which obviously they've been booted out of since then. But like, was it was over Crimea that they were booted out, wasn't it? They were booted out of
Yes, Crimea.
the
Yeah,
G7, so it was Crimea
that's right.
Invasion 2014.
2000,
Yeah.
2014.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And London became an important center for Russian business. So I think the relationship by the end of the time period is pretty strong. They start buying our football clubs. Like okay, going into obviously it's changed again, but by the end of our course in 1997, it's good. So I would say relationships between Britain and USSR were reasonably peaceful. Not because they particularly liked each other, but because Britain was in no position to escalate that into anything else.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Would you agree?
I agree.
I would say that moments of most strain was probably the initial period of Reagan when they didn't really know what
Yes.
they were dealing with, and obviously until Stalin's death, right at the beginning. when the
Yeah.
real Cold War expansion was coming.
Stalin dies in 54, I think, from memory.
Yeah, and at 53, I think, yeah, but around that time. And then obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. But that showed sadly because it was Britain that was de-escalating that from the American presidential side. So I would say relationships were reasonably peaceful, with signs of conflict, but no open hostility.
Reasonably peaceful with mutual suspicions.
Yeah, yeah, I would say that. And
I
then
would.
on to the last of the big gun ones with the relationships, and how has Britain's relationship with Europe always been negative? So now we're dealing with their European relationship, which is quite important in modern times as well. So again, broke it by decades, 50s, then 60s, 70s, then 80s and 90s. So it's like in the positive side for the 50s, they helped create the OEC in 1948 to implement martial aid. So of course, the big fear at that point was the whole of Europe was going to become communist. The Communist Party was massively on the rise in Italy and France, a little bit in Germany. So Britain were quite influential. Marshall, who was the one who came up with the idea of D-Day 2 years before they implemented it, and then also came up with the AIDS. He was obviously quite an astute reader of situations. So basically, the British helped draw up the EEC. It was a British kind of idea of helping to set that up to avoid conflict in Europe, but we didn't enter it. So I think there was no hostility towards Europe, but there was a sense that Europe had to be neutral. It's always with Britain. Europe has to be neutralized. It doesn't come invading Britain. Um, Britain was a founder member of the European Council in 1949, and they agreed to defend Europe in NATO, which I assume would be mainly an American-driven organization. But the fact that they were able to defend Europe, which makes sense because we're part of Europe, and the biggest threat at this point was obviously the Soviet Union. So it rolled through Europe. It wasn't going to stop at the English Channel. Negatives of this, uh, they weren't really interested in joining Europe at this early period, even though they designed it kind of as an idea of that this would keep the Europeans busy and occupied and not fighting each other, but they wouldn't really have an interest in joining it. The main objective of the British government at this point was to make the Commonwealth into an economic powerhouse stronger than Europe. So, because obviously Attlee Labour government had accepted decolonisation, it was going to be in run. India had got independence, but they were still wanting to. The focus was on the Commonwealth. There still was this idea. Still, the legacy of the British Empire was still very firmly in their minds. Uh, Obviously, they did not join either the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952 or the European Economic Community in 1958. So there was no real interest in Britain joining that. When Macmillan did eventually try to come in, of course, you had to get over de Gaulle's blocking powers, and we'll look at that in 1670. So he wasn't really blocking us at this point because we weren't really interested in joining. Britain disliked the idea of a closer union in the Treaty of Rome. They didn't want it to become a United States of Europe in the same way as the United States of America. And Britain's never had any interest in being in that kind of European organization. And there was still a suspicion that France and Germany could not overcome their rivalry. They'd already had three massive wars with the Franco-Prussian War, followed by the First World War, followed by the Second World War. So the British feeling was just like these two countries are kind of locked in some eternal conflict. So I would say in the 50s, it was, well, positive insofar as we set up the European Union's institutions, but negative insofar as Britain didn't. It's not so much negative as Britain just didn't have any interest in joining in with the European Union in the 50s. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that covers it.
Cool. And
That's
then
good.
60s and 70s is where it starts to get a bit more interesting. Um, so Macmillan initially realizes the economy is starting to suffer. They need to deal with something here. And so Macmillan's initial idea was to create the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, in 1960 as a rival to the EEC that did not impact sovereignty. So this was basically with all the left out loser countries that weren't in the first place, like Norway, Switzerland, all of them. And they were trying to think, okay, everyone who's not in the European Union, we're going to create our own European Free Trade Association. Doesn't have the promise of closer economic union. Problem is that the majority of the main European economies are inside the EU. So it's not really going to be that beneficial to be in a free trade grouping of those nations. There were two other big problems in this period. The left of the Labour Party and the right of the Conservative Party were opposed to joining. They've always been allied on this. And this is where their great alliance comes. That's where reform, that Euroscepticism is where reform is picking up votes from both parties now. And it's why Brexit happened, because Brexit happened, the irony of the only time where both parties were run by their wings. So Labour was obviously run by Corbyn during Brexit periods. That was the left wing, the Labour Party, and Conservatives were run by Boris Johnson, which is the right wing Conservative Party. So that the unity of the two wings opposing it means you need a centrist kind of matchup to get it through, which of course you had during the post-war consensus, but you don't really have now. And the left of Labour wanted to implement more socialist policies, and they were worried the EU wouldn't allow them to do that. And the right, the Conservatives had nostalgia for the empire, creating what they call like Singapore on Thames, and like going back to I think the right, the Conservatives haven't really accepted that the British Empire no longer exists. I think they still have in their legacy that it's still around. And then
Mm.
you've got the mighty figure of de Gaulle, which is the bigger objective that he's just blocking British membership until his retirement in 1969. So, and that's why he finally gets Britain in the 70s. So I think de Gaulle's quite an interesting figure because obviously he believed that Britain was like a Trojan horse into Europe, that they only wanted to join for economic reasons, and that their main alliance was always with the United States and not with Europe. And basically said, over my dead body, they won't join. And effectively, he got his wish because they didn't join until he died in 1970. So literally, he had to die for us to join. So I think that shows again the fact that Britain didn't join the initial organizations and then tried to set up a rival organization shows that they weren't really interested in joining. But at the same time, the fact they set up a rival organization suggests they saw the benefits of being the European Union. They just didn't want to come with what comes with it. And that's, I think, the British position throughout afterwards. Um, their rival organization didn't work in the 1670s, so Britain's economy was so bad in 1961 that Macmillan decided they should join the common market, that the price for the economic access was worth it, and then this sparks the constant debate that Britain has had for a long, long time afterwards. But obviously de Gaulle blocks him. Moderate wings of both parties could unite to push for membership of Europe. That's mainly because of the post-war consensus. So there's a lot of overlap, Butskellism, like the Butler wing of the Butler left wing of the Tory party and the Gateskill right wing of the Labour Party are quite united in their beliefs in this. Um, the fact the loss of the empire encouraged Britain to look towards Europe because once the empire's gone, that mercantilist system that was bringing in so much money to the British Empire is now gone. And I think the USA wanted Britain to join because they wanted their Trojan horse inside the European Union, and they do see us as a member inside there in the same way that USA wants Turkey and ideally to put one Muslim nation in, although probably not so much under Erdogan at the moment. Well, actually, probably Trump doesn't even give a shit anyway. But and then Heath was pro-European. You can't underestimate that. Heath was really the first British Prime Minister to be really pro-European. He'd worked on I think under Macmillan, he'd been tasked with getting us into Europe, and he was the one tasked with in 61, and that'd been his personal campaign for a long, long time. And he eventually got Britain into the European Union. So I would say the pragmatic element of the economic benefits to being in Europe meant that the relationship was less negative, but it was basically like they tried every other alternative not to join, realized they couldn't, had to join, and then joined once de Gaulle was dead, so he was no longer blocking them, and then had a pro-European prime minister in Heath. So that's probably, between Heath and Blair are probably the two most pro-European prime ministers we've had in driving those areas. Anything you want to add to that one?
Sounds about right. I mean, again, when answering the question,
Yeah,
it's put in a pretty strong way. Has Britain's
yeah,
relationship with Europe always been negative?
yeah.
And I think clearly no.
No.
It's more it's ambivalent. It
Yeah.
changes sometimes. There are positive elements and there are negative elements. I would use the word ambivalent in the
Yeah,
sense that it's got a mixture of both positive and negative, and then I'd spell out what they are.
yeah, I'd say it's pro-European on economic grounds, but has no interest in the political element or the
Yeah.
political mission for ever closer union is certainly something that no
But
one.
even that's complicated, right?
Yeah,
Because as we just said,
yeah,
it's really moderate wings pro-European.
yeah,
There's a large, there's a core element of British politics, both on the left and the right, that are hostile.
yeah. I think that's
And
the case
so,
now, and they united in Brexit. Those two wings were the united.
yeah,
Centre ground
right,
was the end. Was the
right. Yeah, okay, yeah. I think you put it well. I think the British moderates are interested in a relationship with Europe for economic purposes, to be part of a
I
prosperous
think.
economic
Yeah, I think there's also I would
bloc.
say in my generation there's also like a social solidarity and a feeling of being partially European. I would say in the
Sure,
yeah, which the
sure.
wings just don't feel. But
No, no. But I think, but the prospect of closer political unity
yeah,
with Europe is is really a no-go. Let's
I
say
think so. I think
certainly,
there are people who would want it, but it's definitely a minority.
absolutely. No, that's right. But then that happens to cross over into Thatcher's.
Yeah, with
You know,
mastering.
the long reign of Thatcher. She has three terms after all, and
Yeah,
Thatcher's absolutely opposed to any kind of political, um, closer political ties
yeah.
with
She was
Europe.
quite pro-Europe at the beginning, but then she sees where it's going and she wasn't really interested. And that's her famous no, no, no speech when she
Yeah, that's right.
in Parliament. But yeah, speaking of the 80s and 90s then, so obviously we're in now. So by after he takes her in 73, we're in. So this is like how do you deal with the relationship once they're inside it? So again, it's complex. Always people on one side, people on the other. So Thatcher gets a rebate from Europe in 1984, massively important because they were saying that Britain was paying too much money into the budget and they get that back. If we rejoined, we'd lose that. She did not see the benefits of the EEC because she was like economically, Europe, it was being attached like a dead weight. So that's kind of where the argument's coming out that becomes the argument for Brexit. She gave a speech in 1988 that stated how much of a threat closer European Union was to British sovereignty. I don't think she wanted to leave though. I think she was like, I still think she just was like, she just wanted Europe to be on pause, you know what I mean, and not get closer. I think she was
Yeah,
comfortable with it as an economic union, but was not comfortable with it becoming a pure, full-on political union. And
yeah,
that links into the fear of the Maastricht Treaty under John Major undermining sovereignty and the idea that the concept of ever closer union. And really a fear that it's going to become the United States of Europe. Another negative, so then, but there were on the flip side, there were some Tories who believed the benefits of membership in Europe outweighed the disadvantages. There still are today. Like a lot, like you said, the moderate wing really believed that the economic gains they get from it outweigh the political costs. And they also think they could, when they're inside, they could veto and slow down ever closer union. Then some had believed that inflation could be tackled by joining the exchange rate mechanism because it would hold it down. And Major fought really hard to join that, but then that was humiliated. They were humiliated in 1992 with Black Wednesday when they had to withdraw from the ERM when there was an attack on the pound. So it flipped both ways. Britain did benefit from this period of being part of the world's largest single market because, at the same way they had benefited from mercantilism before, the economy booms from that. And the membership attracted investment because European countries would invest in that. And more importantly, like because they're inside, lots of international firms would set up their offices or headquarters or factories in Britain because it was English speakers, so it was easy to deal with, but was inside the European Union. So, and then of course, free movement of goods, people, and capital made business much easier, but at the expense of a lot of people having hostility towards immigration. So I would
yeah,
say, yeah, in general, I wouldn't say it was definitely always negative. I would say there were definitely benefits, but for the British, the major benefit they saw from it was what they gained economically from Europe, as opposed to
yeah,
but always with this balance of fearing this ever closer union.
yeah. It kind of, in a way, gives some credibility to De Gaulle's hostility to Britain.
Yeah, De Gaulle was
Yeah,
right on a few things because you look at De Gaulle, like De Gaulle's reputation under this Trump administration has just taken a massive jump because De Gaulle said Britain aren't really in it; they're only in it for the money. They have no real loyalty to Europe. They'll leave when they feel like it. He got Brexit bang on. He was the one who said we can't rely on the Americans for defense in Europe. Like you can't rely on your nuclear program to be entirely tied down to American stuff, and that we need a separate deterrent, which is what the French made, so that in case America becomes an unreliable actor, well, wasn't wrong on that either. So,
yeah,
let's say De Gaulle, I think De Gaulle's reputation is about to take a historical uplift.
yeah, yeah,
Because no one in Britain, I think Britain are blinded by the special relationship where we thought the Americans would never do that. I think because there's a lot more cultural similarity between Britain and America, I think the British never saw that coming. You know what I mean? But they tended to overlook maybe the cultural differences between America and Britain.
yeah, yeah,
Um, America's significantly much more conservative country than Britain is.
yeah.
So would we say overall it wasn't totally negative? There were
No,
moments.
I think it's ambivalent.
Yeah,
Again, I think
yeah,
it's got positives and negatives.
yeah.
But to say it's always been negative is wrong.
No, I'd said that they had no real interest though until Macmillan, and I think they only had an interest in joining when it was economically beneficial when their economy was damaged. I don't think they had any other interest otherwise.
Mm.
Apart from Heath, I think Heath was genuinely driven to join. That's one of Heath's big positive point, I think.
Mm.
And then this next essay then is why has the British nuclear deterrent been controversial? Which I don't know if they'll ever do this as an essay, but if they do, you've only really got two sides. Where is it positive? Why is it negative? I do not see any other way you can kind of argue this. I don't see it being an essay, but it's worth covering nonetheless. So basically, it's the long-held argument. This is basically a Labour Party dispute between the Conservatives have no people saying it's negative, I believe. It's the right wing of Britain is all like the nuclear deterrence positive. I think in the Labour Party, you've got the right wing, moderate wing of the Labour Party thinks it's a positive thing. The left wing of the Labour Party thinks it's a negative thing. We'll just very cover which one it would, or the two arguments on either side. So the positives for having a nuclear deterrent. I mean, I think actually now the arguments on the positive side are even stronger, I think, than they were before.
Oh, absolutely. Stop. I mean, the big example is Ukraine.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons.
yeah,
And if they hadn't, they would be in a very different
yeah.
position, I
Because of
think.
security guarantees from the Americans.
Because it's, yeah, that's right. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, it's hard to, I think the positive sides are hard to deny, um, at least in the current situation.
Yeah, was not. Yeah, it's betrayal, total betrayal. Um, so the Labour government undoubtedly built a nuclear bomb because before the NATO treaty was signed, they were nervous the US might not defend Europe. Yeah, and he wasn't wrong. They're not defending Europe now. I mean, to be fair to America, what is in their interest to defend Europe? It isn't in their interest. What in a pure power politics interest, it isn't anymore because they don't see Russia as their main threat. Russia is not an existential threat to America. It's an existential threat to Europe.
I don't know. That might be a bit exaggerated because the US is still supporting the Ukrainian efforts uh, to this day.
If you're
But
European
anyway,
now,
so so
you cannot feel confident that America will always have the back.
no, you feel nervous. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
They've got to take care of their own defense. It's not even a question anymore.
yeah,
They needed nuclear weapons as the Soviet conventional army was so much greater, and that applies to the Russian one now as well in the same.
yeah. That's
Like
right.
it's like they just do not like the welfare state spending in Europe means they're just not going to have an army at the level which can
Yeah.
provide manpower.
And that's one of the big factors for the nuclear arsenal is that you can have nuclear bombs
Yeah,
and not need to worry about conventional, a large, large army,
yeah,
conventional army. At least that was the traditional wisdom.
yeah.
So I'm not sure whether that argument still holds, given that there's a big, again, war between Russia and Ukraine.
I think a lot
In
of
some
things are
ways,
changing now. So like a lot of what were the assumptions literally even just a year ago and are now all on
yeah,
board. It's good. It's a
yeah,
wake up. It's a wake up.
it's very interesting. Although of course Russia still does use the threat of
Yeah.
nuclear attack as a kind of last resort and as a leverage against the West.
Yeah.
Um,
If it ever becomes clear that the Americans wouldn't defend a nuclear attack from Russia, that makes Europe very vulnerable.
yes. Um, so okay, yeah,
Yeah, British
next
nuclear
one.
deterrent contributes to the defense of Western Europe, although now we're finding out that we may not actually be able to operate independently of the United States anyway, because they have control triggers on most of the nuclear ones. So I would say the French umbrella is more of an umbrella than that.
Yeah,
Um, and nuclear arms maintains great power status. I mean, that's true that all five members of the United Nations Security Council get their vetoes because they have nuclear weapons.
yeah.
And it's obvious nuclear weapons give you more power. I mean, when people are arguing, oh, why does Iran want the nuclear bomb? Well, why do you think? Look at
Oh no, sorry.
no,
Look at North Korea.
yeah, look at North Korea. Look, Israel is armed. Look at Israel. Look at Pakistan. Look at North Korea. None of those countries have nuclear weapons. It makes a difference. It's like,
Does
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's not even. I mean, the people. It's disingenuous for people to argue why do they want the bomb? Well, the same reason everybody's got it wants it because you get a
that's
seat at the
right.
table, even if
That's
you're a
right.
mad nutter. You're like, look at
That's
North
right.
Korea. There's no way. If North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons, they would not have any say in anything anywhere in the world.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's obvious, and like that's why, like Japan and South Korea are now considering it. Germany is, South Africa is, Egypt is, Saudi Arabia is, Iran is, Turkey is, and that's the danger of America withdrawing its nuclear umbrella, that we get nuclear proliferation,
Yeah.
and then
But the question we're looking at is why is it controversial,
yeah, yeah,
not which policy is better.
yeah,
So
that's true. But I think
um,
that's partially the argument anyway. And so the controversial element of it is, since Macmillan got JFK to supply Britain with Polaris missiles, the British nuclear deterrent has been dependent on Americans, which is true, and we're finding
right.
out now.
That's because the Americans have to manufacture the missiles themselves, right, for the
I
British
think they have
warheads.
I didn't realize this. I think they have trigger control over the submarines so that we can't launch without their okay. And I think they've got effective, like, not what about kill switches on our nuclear deterrent?
Really?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Which has made everyone go, whoa, shit, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a real problem. Because if, like, America
If
goes,
I was Britain, I wouldn't have. If I was Britain, I wouldn't have settled for that.
no, but I don't think Britain ever
But
thought that they'd be in a position where they had to strategically plan for a hostile
that's
America.
why. That's yeah. Well, that's why you need to,
Yeah. Well, they will now.
plan for uncertainty.
They will now. Do you
So,
know they have kill switches on all their airplanes as well and everything else they sell?
yeah,
So
amazing.
Trump's policy is going to massively hurt the defense industry in America because people aren't going to want to buy American equipment anymore.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's clear. So good if you're a European arms manufacturer.
Yeah, yeah. Massively good. Like they're going to take, there's going to be a new industrial revolution in Europe because we can't buy anything American anymore. Trump, he really doesn't think long term
Yeah.
consequences of his actions. Um, the UK arsenal is virtually irrelevant in comparison to Soviet American arsenals, which is true. Although now with the American arsenal being, I mean, this it becomes much more important. I think I think it will be seen much less controversially if America withdraws its nuclear umbrella. I think.
But yeah, but I mean, isn't it true that it's true though that I mean, a nuclear weapon's a nuclear weapon. You don't need many to cause a massive problem,
No,
right?
but we
So
are a much tinier country than Russia.
sure,
Yeah.
sure.
We can't, I mean, we couldn't, Putin could just move somewhere we can't hit. It's very expensive to maintain and money could be spent on other things. That's generally the argument from the left wing, the Labour Party, is that money could be spent
Yeah.
on other things. But I mean, there's no point having a welfare state if you don't exist as a country. So, like, so I think that would be the key one. And like,
But
obviously,
yeah, I've always found this a problem. I mean, just to speak a little subjectively for a
yeah,
second, I've always found this a problem with the left
yeah.
that they don't national security concerns they tend to take for granted. It's like everyone's living in what peaceful world, and we need to focus on social concerns at the expense of geopolitical
Because they
concerns.
can with America providing the umbrella. The problem is when America stops.
Right, right.
The key is but then there's always that hope on the left that they're saying, oh, Trump's just doing this because he wants to prove point. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think you can take the risk. I think you need to have something. And obviously that leads in 1958 to the CND campaign for nuclear disarmament set up. So there's like an
Yeah,
active campaign. And as we
that's
know,
what they can.
yeah. And that forced Gateskill to run the election in 59 on a policy of nuclear disarmament, which was catastrophic suicide against.
Oh my goodness, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So like he was forced to by the trade unions. Another problem with the trade unions forcing him to run on a campaign. I, I think I'm not sure it will be seen as controversial. I mean, it, I think that in the current world, I think probably people thought, oh, post-Cold War, why do we need to keep paying for this system? No one's going to fire them
Sure.
anyway. And now I don't think I don't think anyone's questioning it quite at that level anymore after what's
No.
happened.
No,
Uh,
but we're not talking about people today. We're still in that period. We're
yeah,
still
yeah,
we're
yeah.
still in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
But that's I
understandable.
just don't see this being a question, but you never know. They asked some weirdo
Sure.
questions last year on
Yeah.
stuff, so it is in the book because anything in the book can be asked, and the nuclear deterrent question is in the book. So if they go there, those would be the two sides of it, I would argue.
But it's actually not a difficult question. I mean, why is it being controversial? All you need to do is state the both sides of the argument, and you're done, and
Yeah,
you're
yeah, yeah. I
set.
don't see how you turn. I couldn't
Uh,
work out how to turn this into a 5 paragraph essay. I thought you've just literally
yeah.
got one side and the other. I don't
But
see.
you can go through the factors, but
You could, but I don't see how you'd write much of a paragraph on each one. That's just why I just feel like it's a
Yeah,
bit weak. I mean, most of the Britain essays can be turned into 4 paragraph essays, which is good because people run out of time doing the source question on Churchill. So
yeah.
then when they run out of time, they get to kind of attack these afterwards.
Okay.
So
All
cool.
right.
We've done that one, then we'll stop and we'll go for the last two, I think.